Hello and welcome again to Sport on Lot, the podcast digesting the week's sports news with interviews and analysis. Coming up, we'll be exploring the new rules around transgender athletes from the IOC. Also, just where is Peng Shuai? Still concerns over the fate of the Chinese tennis player, despite calls between the IOC president and Peng Shuai. Also, corruption in the IOC world. Former chief of the Rio Olympics, Carlos Nuzman, has been jailed. What does that tell us about the murky world of the IOC? And in football, cryptocurrency concerns still grow. Just how did Man City get a sponsorship and then drop it so quickly? And we're 1 year out from the Qatar World Cup, and there's been more developments around that anniversary. We'll give you the lowdown on them, particularly from the world of Bayern Munich too. But first, we'll be going in depth in a moment on one of the subjects of the week in England, the review into football governance. And it's been certainly a busy one with the fallout from that. So, as ever, I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, and alongside me, Martyn Ziegler from the Times and Tariq Panja from the New York Times. Welcome along.
Hi, guys. Yeah, this review by Tracy Crouch, the former sports minister, long awaited, was launched after the European Super League. And the findings are sort of fairly widely expected, that it's recommending an independent regulator. The other interesting part of it is a 10% levy on transfers, which would then be used to go down the pyramid to provide more money for clubs in lower leagues. Now, you love an independent regulator, Tariq, don't you?
Partly. I also don't think the Football Association, UEFA, FIFA, all the structures that exist now are compatible with 21st century, to be honest with you. They are both event companies and regulators. We banged on about this every week on this podcast. That puts them in a conflict of interest position. So they're unable to regulate in a true and transparent way, because the teams or the actors they rely on as businesses are also the ones they're regulating. That's why I think whoever the regulator is, whether it's called an independent regulator or whatever body, should be outside of the competition organizer. So yeah, if you want to call it an independent regulator, I'm into that. But what I'm more into is, if you do have rules, you should be able to enforce them. And we've talked about loads of examples, Martyn, over the years and on this pod as well, of rules that exist that are really good, that for some reason are not enforced, or some sort of fudge is decided behind the scenes. That is what I'd like to see happen. Whether it's an independent regulator that's able to do it or not, I don't know.
Well, the Premier League is now supportive in principle of the appointment of an independent regulator, but the Premier League's chief executive, Richard Masters, has told the BBC that the game needs to be careful of what he's calling the unintended consequences.
Well, I think it's all a balance, isn't it? And obviously, life is going to be different if the independent regulator comes through, and obviously government as well as football authorities have got to consider all of these recommendations. So we will put our views forward in the coming months. Government has said it's going to decide upon its policy by the spring. We won't be resistant to change, but we've got to be careful that the right balance is struck. So we go back to those key principles, is that football is able to continue to be successful. So I think that Tracy would say that if you have strong and effective financial regulation, that drives profitability and would drive investment. And I agree with that. It's a question of whether the 47 recommendations get us to that point, and it's paramount that we understand those.
Premier League Chief Executive Richard Masters there. Martyn, how effective do you think the regulator can be?
When you look at the independent regulator, it'll have an owners and directors test, but I don't think it can operate outside company law. So somebody can still be banned for 8 years as a director, and then once that becomes spent, they can buy a club. I mean, that's happened with Bolton Wanderers in the past. And I don't see how the regulator can stop that, because we have this. It's against the law of the land. The other thing is, I mean, it has been suggested that the regulator could have stopped the takeover of Newcastle by a Saudi-backed consortium on human rights grounds. No way at all. I mean, if this regulator is going to be appointed by the government putting huge pressure on the Premier League, 18 months ago to get them to do the allow the Saudis to take over. The Premier League stood up to them for ages. It was only when they'd finally exhausted the whole legal processes around piracy that they eventually sort of approved it. I think with an independent regulator, they'd probably have been approved much earlier. So I'm not quite sure what the. I understand why that lots of people jumping up and down because the owners and directors test hasn't been as strong as it should be. And this idea of business plans and a 3-year business plan and a licensing system, I think that's a very good idea. I just don't think it necessarily needs an independent body to do that.
One of the things highlighted by former FA chairman David Bernstein on a media call on Thursday was the fact that, yes, it might not have blocked the Newcastle takeover necessarily, but there hopefully might have been more transparency over how the decision was reached, because that's certainly something we still don't have over just why the takeover was approved.
Rob, that's the word, I think, with all of this, is if something gets rid of the murkiness, the stuff that happens behind the scenes, I think for spectators, for media, for club executives of other teams as well, people want to see a transparent process. What is going on? How are decisions derived? And it's not just on ownership. It's all sorts of decisions. For example, that Man City FFP case is now in its 3rd year. What is going on? That team has won 2 league championships. Maybe everything's fine. But 3 years of an investigation and no one knows what exactly is being investigated and when we're going to get resolution is something that troubles the judge at the High Court too, who's opined on it recently.
And if you're all struggling to keep track of these cases, they are the same Football Leaks documents that Manchester City was investigated over by UEFA, but eventually a ban from the Champions League was overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which found that the information was too old and the case was time-barred. City deny wrongdoing, but the case is still being pursued, isn't it, by the Premier League?
When you have the league looking at investigating these cases, because the league is basically made up of the 20 clubs, I do take your point absolutely that is an issue, and perhaps that should actually be the governing body, or if we're going to have a regulator, then fair enough. That is probably a good thing. But what do you think about this idea of a transfer levy to sort of push more money down the pyramid? I mean, already a fair amount goes, but it just makes a lot of it goes in parachute payments.
The principle itself of transfer levies is not new. There's already something in place, as Richard Masters, the Premier League chief executive, explained on the BBC.
See, it's a radical idea because there is a levy already. You've got 4% on domestic transfers, levy on top of transfer prices, and that money goes to player welfare and youth development costs across the pyramid.
If you look at the spending, the big 6 clubs in England, they would contribute over the last few years. They would have contributed half the total transfer levy, just those 6 clubs themselves. So maybe it is a way of sort of some more equitable redistribution.
Yeah, well, this talk about money going down the pyramid, I'm also interested in how that money's spent. This money that goes to the clubs lower down, are they just going to buy more players and spend more money on salary, or is there going to be rules governing how that's done? Because we want break even. We don't want clubs to go bust. That's been the problem.
The report does say that had the 10% levy been applied in the last 5 seasons, £160 million more could have been redistributed, which, if it had gone into clubs lower down the pyramid, maybe it had just gone out more on salaries and transfer fees and led to some of this overspending that in the gamble to get promoted. Something else on the finances that's quite interesting, away from direct regulation, is the fact that, of course, alcohol in England can't be sold or drunk inside the pitch in the top 5 divisions, which is something that the report says should be looked at. Maybe in the lower leagues, you get drinking allowed. The police, though, say it would lead to more trouble involving fans. But what's most striking is the oddity that a 6th tier club can sell booze, a 5th tier club can't. And if you get promoted, it can actually be quite financially prohibitive because suddenly you get this drop off in revenue. So it does lead to this question, how and should drinking be allowed at games again?
Yeah, the Mark Roberts, the chief constable, who's the UK football police lead, is absolutely furiously opposed to this. But yeah, I can see, especially League One, League Two. I mean, I can't say it's a big issue there, is it? Surely not.
Of course, one of the unresolved things in a year's time is not whether we'll be drinking in EFL stadiums in England, but in stadiums at the Qatar World Cup, because this time next year, the World Cup will be underway, and still one of those issues surrounding the tournament, particularly one fans are very interested in, is whether or not they'll be able to drink in stadiums. They will be able to in hotels and bars, and we saw in the fan zone at the 2019 Club World Cup in Qatar too. Perhaps this is the least thorniest of the issues facing Qatar, with now less than a year to go until the World Cup.
Yeah, I don't think all fans around the world are concerned about the beer. It's in certain countries, if I'm honest, that the debate and the conversation's really heightened on this, and I think there will be. And you mentioned the 2019 Club World Cup, Rob. You and I were there for that, and I do remember one of the things that they did for this was put on cheap beer at these particular out of town venues, like in fields, music festivals, etc. And then what they decided was then to bus supporters to the stadium where the matches were going to be played, and that journey took quite a while. And what they hadn't thought through is when people drink a lot of alcohol, they also need to go to the toilet. So what happened is people came streaming out of those buses and essentially took a leak wherever they could. So the line all the way up to that stadium, there were people pretty much urinating in the street. And they say all these events into building to the World Cup are learning opportunities, and I'm hoping they may have learned something about that on their journey to hosting this tournament.
It did surprise me the police actually didn't really intervene at the time when I saw some fans urinating by the side of the stadium at the Khalifa Stadium when they did finally arrive from that fan zone. So a bit of tolerance level, and tolerance actually came up when we were on a call with a year to go with the chief executive of the World Cup joint venture with FIFA, Nasser Al-Khater, and it did really highlight, as we're on the call, some of those challenges in terms of how they're sort of directing the messaging, because they want to sort of portray themselves as liberal and welcoming while knowing they're actually still having to navigate within the laws of Qatar. So, for instance, that is around things like saying gay players and gay fans are welcome, while they do skirt around the anti-LGBT laws as well. What else struck you, Tariq, from that call with the CEO?
It was, to me, it was a remarkable call for a number of reasons, particularly the performance of the Qatar 2022 CEO, essentially being given the chief spokesman position. He's the guy who they've picked to speak on behalf of this World Cup. And what struck me was how little detail he knew in terms of some of the most pressing issues, certainly when it comes to the media. Rob, you were on that call, and I thought, I'll ask a question, and it's not a very controversial or surprising question given the subjects and the focus on worker welfare and worker deaths in Qatar in the build-up. Very simple question: how many people have died building the World Cup? And I know there's conflicting numbers depending on who you ask, but I wanted to know, how many people did the Qatar 2022 Supreme Committee believe had died on World Cup projects? And what we got was, I don't know, I think it's 4 or is it 5, something like that. And he called on one of the PR advisors also on the call to say, ask what the number was. And the guy said, oh, it's 3. Now, honestly, given the scrutiny and given the subject matter, we're talking about people's lives lost. The fact the guy didn't know, I think it was deeply concerning and quite embarrassing for organisers. What did you make of it?
Well, the fact is, he wasn't just talking to us as media on the call. These are the questions you would expect he gets when he's meeting chief executives of FAs, visiting delegations. And it's been one of the hottest matters of the build-up to the World Cup. You also asked about this headline figure of 6,500 deaths, which has been reported by The Guardian, and it's a wider figure over all the people who are migrant workers in Qatar, over the last decade. So not just people building World Cup stadiums particularly. And probably one of the things that confuses, and Gareth Southgate, the England manager, was reflecting this again this week when he was talking about needing to find out all the information himself and being unsure of information, is the differing figures, the different data that's out there, but also the complexity of it. Because while they might talk about work-related deaths, people dying particularly on building sites in particular being very low, it's actually about the high prevalence of the number of people dying at ages perhaps when they shouldn't normally. And when they say of natural causes, well, should they be at those ages? And perhaps if there was more information around inquests and things like that, that would provide some of the substance. So that is where some of the complexity comes from this. It's not necessarily in the numbers themselves, but actually whether or not these people are dying at a higher prevalence rate, for instance, than would be expected.
Yeah, because if you're calculating the sort of the number of deaths attributed to the World Cup, I mean, there's the World Cup stadiums, but there's also all the infrastructure around, and the population of Qatar has gone, since they won the vote, has gone up from 1.7 million to 2.7 million. 1 million more people. They're almost all migrant workers brought in to work on transforming the country, and not surprising, there's a very strong focus from media investigating what workers' living conditions are like. And I had another very embarrassing episode for the Qataris when two Norwegian journalists were arrested for allegedly trespass, because from what I understand, what they did is they went around filming with a permit, but they were told they had no permit to film in the industrial zone. What they decided, they want to go and they didn't want to be taken somewhere. They wanted to go and see for themselves what an accommodation block was like in this zone. They went in, found themselves arrested, in jail for 36 hours, released, and then went back to Norway, but their equipment was confiscated. So there's going to be a lot more of this focus in the next year, I think.
And you get the impression that I'm sure the Qatar World Cup organisers probably didn't want them arrested. It's brought unwelcome attention with a year to go, but it's not something that was necessarily in their control, because they don't necessarily have the ability to know what the rest of the state is doing. Although there are still times when in the country that if you do go somewhere, it's very quickly discovered that you have been visiting somewhere. And here is one of the things around the working conditions and the reporting of migrant workers in Qatar. Very often there will be some favourable quotes published out there from workers saying actually things have improved, conditions are welcome. It's not always necessarily clear if those workers have been provided for comment by the Supreme Committee. Having done that myself in terms of the media tours and seen what happens, yes, you can be presented with the workers they want you to speak to. And yes, they might well be, of course, giving their actual true position. Nothing to doubt what their views are. But you are in a managed environment in the sense you've been taken somewhere or you've been presented with the people that they want you to hear from. So that's what magnifies the need as reporters to be able to go to find and seek the workers yourselves, to get an independent view, to have a conversation also where they're not in the vision of the Supreme Committee or people affiliated to them. So hopefully they can speak freely, and that might be either positively or indeed with some skepticism. And they might well welcome you into their accommodation for you to speak to them. So they are happy for you to be there, but technically it counts as being on property that they don't have the permission to grant you the ability to report from.
Thing is, with the workers as well, you've got to think these are extremely vulnerable people. These are desperately hard, low-paid jobs. You have to be quite desperate to do them. And the risk of talking to anyone in a country like that, real, imagined, probably real, probably quite high among people. I think that's the challenge. We as media have to be cautious as well about exposing people to scrutiny from their employers and the country where they are. And the Norwegian journalists, they kind of knew that were going to need to break the law in that country about trespass and private property. And there's the chicken and egg thing for me, is that this type of journalism is really important. And there is almost no other way of doing it, because you mentioned it. You can't do it in a spoon-fed way that, hi, we're from the country of Qatar. We'd like to lead you by the hand to show you worker accommodation and how well they're treated. It's just not tenable to do, to clearly provide a proper picture that way. And it reminds me a bit like, when certain big industrial companies' warehouses are exposed by journalists in, say, in Britain or the United States. They have to go in undercover and they show working conditions, or on farms or places like that. There is no other way of doing this. So if you're a Norwegian or anyone, a TV journalist, it happens to TV journalists, seems more about these restrictions on equipment and filming. That's what they get them for, and they seize their data cards and all the rest of it. There is no other way of doing it. And Rob, you're right. I think the governing body of the World Cup in Qatar, what is it, the Supreme Committee, they get extremely frustrated every time this type of thing happens, and it will continue happening because they're so disconnected. There are elements of that government who couldn't care one jot about what the Supreme Committee is trying to show. And they've got a different constituency as well, a local constituency. And it's kind of dysfunctional. So today, if you, Rob or Martyn, we got on a plane, we said, well, let's take film crew, go to Qatar. I think we could just go and do some filming, and we will be arrested if we didn't get permission. It is almost a cast iron certainty that's going to happen. And then we're going to have more and more stories. It's an insane situation.
Should probably be clear that actually there are countries like the United States that do require journalists to get working visas to be able to actually go and report in the country. Even some places in central London, you wouldn't know a private property. Some areas outside Wembley that you have to get permission to film from if you even want to sort of chat to some fans. That's not from the FA itself, just from private property owners. So there are degrees of permission needed in places, but here is very much around Qatar and how much independent reporting it does allow.
We've had quite a strong response from some countries in Europe about what they're going to do to raise the profile of human rights in Qatar. Denmark, for example, they're doing something. But I was quite taken by this Bayern Munich's annual general meeting, where you actually had the president and the vice president of the club being booed for effectively stating that they were engaging with Qatar had brought about change in the country, and then the president refused to allow one of the members to put a motion to the meeting. He refused to allow that to go forward, and there was really loud jeering and booing. I mean, it just shows it's for a lot of clubs now, it's going to be actually quite a difficult issue to deal with.
And this is particularly over Bayern Munich's sponsorship deal with Qatar Airways. And we can now take a listen, courtesy of Deutsche Welle, the booing at the Bayern AGM and the chancellor of "We are Bayern, not you."
Guys, the motion as well, which was passed by 77.8% of the members in attendance, so a huge number of people at that AGM, was for the club to identify itself with internationally acknowledged human rights. Quite remarkable and quite embarrassing for the board members on the panel to say, sorry, we can't identify this club with internationally acknowledged human rights, which is what happened there. I mean, it's extremely embarrassing for Bayern Munich, and they've had long links to Qatar and also been embarrassed by them before. The former chief executive of Bayern Munich, former great German player, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, he was caught out by German authorities on arrival from a trip to Qatar for not declaring a very expensive watch he'd received from the Qataris. So yeah, they seem to have got themselves tangled up in another mess.
And sometimes, and we get this from the Qatar World Cup CEO in particular, Nasser Al-Khater, at the weekend, complaining about the media coverage, unfair scrutiny. But a lot of it, of course, is grounded in reality, real reporting and scrutiny as well, that other elements of Qatar, and indeed FIFA President Gianni Infantino, would say have improved conditions in Qatar and point to the benefits of that scrutiny, of delivering the change that rights groups have demanded, which of course does not mean that was necessarily the reason to give Qatar the World Cup in the first place. And the fact the expectation is countries should have the suitable, safe, fair conditions before actually being awarded a tournament. But a contradiction perhaps in some of those statements between World Cup organisers complaining about the scrutiny and FIFA wanting to sort of see that scrutiny as being a positive of the World Cup and delivering change. And we can get the thoughts now of the FIFA President Gianni Infantino speaking in Doha this week.
It's of course not easy. It takes of course time. Of course not everything is perfect, but changes have been made, and it's fair to say that without the World Cup, without the spotlights of this World Cup, these changes would have probably taken decades to happen. Now in a few years some changes have happened. The kafala system was abolished. Migrant workers can change, and let's not forget that work is also dignity. You don't give charity to people, you give them a job, you give them an opportunity. There are now minimum wages. The safety conditions of the workers have improved greatly, and it's not me saying it. It's not about FIFA to say this. We are a sports organization. It's labor unions, it's international organizations, and I think we have to recognize that, and we have to encourage countries like Qatar, other countries in the Gulf and in other parts of the world to embrace these changes and to move forward for the protection of rights of workers.
Well, there will be an early chance for some fans to go to Qatar as well next year, because the intercontinental playoffs for the World Cup in June are actually due to be staged in Qatar, which will perhaps create one issue, which is the fact fans going will suddenly experience the fierce summer heat that the whole World Cup move to November, December was intended to avoid. And guessing Qatar might have to do quite a job reinforcing to people it won't be that hot in the 40s when it comes to the World Cup itself. But FIFA also are looking at other changes in Qatar, which is on removing the gripes around offside. Or I say remove the gripes, actually this automated offside system would lead to even more pedantic calls potentially that Martyn, you've been reporting on.
Yeah, so this is this semi-automated offside system using computers, artificial intelligence, lots and lots of cameras, 29 cameras, which would automatically detect if a player's offside and then send a message to the VAR. So you'd have a sort of virtually instantaneous message. The VAR then looks to see if he's interfering with play, the attacker, and then we can make a decision. But you're right, this will lead to potentially very, very marginal calls being given. There's already been a huge outcry about that. And in fact, the Premier League in England this season has gone back to giving more leeway to the attackers, because there's people just don't like this, being offside by a fraction of a toe, which also is why I think FIFA and Arsene Wenger, the head of global football development, are very seriously pushing this idea of changing the actual offside law, so there should be daylight between the attacker and the defender. So swinging the pendulum back in favour of the attacking player. And I think that might go hand in hand with this sort of automated offside.
Not the worst idea, because most people watch football hoping for a goal to be scored, and if the rules are uniform and this automated system works, and it can discover daylight, why not?
I also think it's a good thing because actually at a sort of grassroots level, effectively that is how offsides are judged, because unless you're really, really skilled assistant referee, you can only properly judge it when there is an offside. So I think in practice that's how it functions. And then to put it into the professional game where you have cameras and everything is not, as you say, not the worst idea.
The IFAB meeting also this week, killing off the idea which somehow got reheated a bit around extending half times that we discussed a few weeks ago. So that proposal from South America to expand from 15 to 25 minutes at half times, give that flexibility, off the table, particularly around player welfare. That was the latest meeting of football's lawmakers. Perhaps something football needs to be paying a lot closer attention to is the world of cryptocurrency, which has creepingly just become this dominant force in terms of sponsorship announcements, players promoting them, other entities as well across the game promoting fan tokens and NFTs and Bitcoins, which to a lot of people might just look like regular sponsorships and another cash stream. But we've already seen with Manchester City having to drop a deal with a company that didn't seem to have much of a digital footprint, and the alarm created over just how this deal ever came about with the crypto firm.
Yeah, the issue with cryptocurrency is that it's completely unregulated. So you have a situation where you can put money into cryptocurrency, and there are many different ones now. And if something happens and you go, that company disappears for whatever reason, there's no sort of authority for the investor to get their money back. So I think we've talked before that some of these firms are sort of setting up partnerships with football clubs where they offer fan engagement by buying tokens, but it's still about trading tokens. It's still about cryptocurrency. And the Manchester City thing, I mean, that's just a remarkable thing. That 3 Key Technologies was this platform that announced a partnership on Manchester City's website, and then they mentioned the names of several company executives on that release and then on another release. But when I did a simple internet search, I found that they didn't appear to exist, these people. 5 separate named executives. None of them had any sort of internet presence anywhere, nothing on LinkedIn. I mean, questions have been raised quite how what sort of due diligence was done to this to be allowed. And as a result, about 2 days after I reported this, the Manchester City suspended the partnership and removed the announcement from its website.
But what did they say, Martyn? They said they were going to conduct some due diligence, didn't they?
They said they always conduct due diligence, but I'm not quite sure what exactly was done.
Hang on a minute. You've just said you've done a Google search, Martyn. And Manchester City, commercial behemoth in world football. I mean, their sponsorship deals are astonishing. With a commercial team they have, how come they hadn't been able to find out what you did by tapping in what key technologies, Google Go, LinkedIn? What were they doing, Martyn? They might need you to pop in and show them how to do it.
Don't give away the secrets. A lot of companies might charge a lot of money for this valuable device that is actually just using Google to actually try to do due diligence on these companies. But it is amazing that at so many steps along the process, whether it was the commercial team or even the people even tasked with actually sending out the final announcement, they didn't just happen to sort of search around. And maybe at each stage in the process, they assumed the stage above them carried out the checks. And of course, if I was getting the sign off on this, and someone must have actually had the conversations, but it just is a reminder to be inquisitive.
Or millions of pounds are being offered to you as a club in a sponsorship, and you're going to take it. I mean, we're going around the houses a bit here. This was only cancelled after the media started talking about it, and it wasn't the only one, was it, Rob? I think Barcelona last week had to scrap a crypto deal, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. This was after the consultant linked to Onyx, an Israeli Moshe Hageg, who also owns the football club Betar Jerusalem. Well, he was arrested in Israel on allegations of fraud, and that was fraud related to cryptocurrency, as well as other allegations too. He denies wrongdoing, and Barcelona had only announced this deal to launch non-fungible tokens or NFTs with Onyx on November the 5th, and it was dropped within a couple of weeks after this. And these NFTs would have been bought through the digital currency Ethereum. It's a whole area that fans have to get accustomed to, particularly when we get the sense that fan engagement is being driven through these sorts of platforms too now. So how many sort of long-standing fans will even be familiar with things like the socios at buying fan engagement? And to be fair, it struck me as something missing in that English Review of Football Governance that they called fan-led, which is even in the sort of, 6 months or so since it was commissioned, we've got loads of clubs now saying the way for fans to engage is through buying these socios fan tokens. And you delve into the reality, and it's things like choosing the song pre-match. And Leeds got into a bit of hot water because they were suggesting there was a vote on the final song that would be played right before kickoff. Actually, fans started questioning, are you getting rid of Marching On Together? And they said, eventually, no, it's a vote on the final song, isn't it, before the players leave after warming up for the final bit before eventually returning.
Mentioning Ethereum, Rob, I've been looking into this the last week, and so that's one of the cryptocurrencies which Rangers Football Club in Scotland are using. Now they're offering these NFTs. These are not. These are things that are digital assets, digital memorabilia. They don't actually exist in a physical form. So Rangers, for example, are offering 1,000 digital championship medals from last season, and you can buy them for like $50. And then you have to pay what's called a gas fee on top, which is a transaction fee to Ethereum of $150. So that fee has disappeared. That's not part of your value. So you've got this digital medal, and all you have is basically a record on an electronic ledger somewhere that you've bought one of these things. I mean, you can't do anything with it. You can, perhaps you can see it as an investment, but you need it to rise at least 4 times in value just to cover just the gas fee itself. So, not surprising, I think. Anyway, in 3 days of trading, they'd sold, I think, 14 of the 1,000 that were available for sale. I mean, you're quite right to mention the fact that it wasn't covered in the Football Review by Tracy Crouch. I mean, there is some positive news in that this was raised by fans groups at their most recent meeting with the Premier League's chief executive, the whole issue around crypto. And the chief executive, Richard Masters, committed to looking into this, and he promised the fans representative that he's going to ask the chief commercial officer to look into the issue in more detail. But he also revealed that the Premier League itself was exploring NFTs and digital collectibles. But I mean, he did stress that they were approaching it in a very slow and cautious manner, and they were going to look into all of this. So, I mean, I think government regulation will come, but until then, it's a bit of a wild west.
Yeah, it's not limited to England, though, Martin. I mean, other leagues have already piled straight into this. La Liga are all over this stuff. You guys, both of you, have spoken in great detail, mentioning things like Ethereum and NFTs and God knows what stuff that I find very difficult to understand. But for me, there's a fundamental flaw with all of this. The idea that fans have to pay to engage with their football teams, it just seems awful. Fans already pay, whether they're in the stadium or whether they're outside the stadium. Most have to buy expensive television packages. Many will buy jerseys for themselves and their families. Those who go to games will be paying for season tickets. And now you're paying for the right to be able to talk to your club. And listen, I have an issue with this idea that this is being pitched as a fan engagement platform, because I don't think it is a fan engagement platform, and the numbers tell you that. The number of token holders, Rob mentioned socios, because that's the most popular one. There are others too. The number of token holders who actually participate in any of these kind of polls for a song or a club wallpaper or anything else that is so marginal to the running or of the football team is tiny. This is using the popularity of football to create a tradable product. And that's what it is. And no one is doing anything about it.
Well, I wonder if we offered fan tokens for this pod, whether or not a few people would be buying them up, particularly at the IOC, to stop us playing this clip coming up now from 2009 from, of all people, Robin Williams on the CBS Late Show, talking just after Chicago lost out on the right to stage the 2016 Olympics to Rio de Janeiro. Take a listen.
I hope Oprah's not too bummed about losing the Olympics, you know, that Chicago sent Oprah and Michelle. Brazil sent 50 strippers and a pound of blow. Wasn't really fair, you know?
Robin Williams had it right. There was corruption. The vote wasn't fair. We now have a court ruling that there was vote buying for the Rio 2016 Olympics. Carlos Nuzman, the head of the Brazilian Olympic Committee for more than 2 decades, has now been sentenced to more than 30 years in prison over this vote buying scheme for those Olympics.
Yeah, Carlos Nuzman is he was a very, very sort of familiar figure as an IOC member for the best part of a decade. And, always sort of very chatty to journalists and seemed like a sort of charismatic guy. He was in charge of the Rio Olympic bid. But what now has come out is the fact he was organising a conspiracy to bribe fellow members. I mean, we're not just 1 or 2, we're talking at least 6, possibly 9, and millions of dollars changing hands. And the president of World Athletics at the time, Lamine Diack, and his son Papa Massata Diack, implicated in this. We've had some very famous names of former Olympians, IOC members, named as having received the bribes. They've denied it. That's yet to be proved. But it's hugely embarrassing for the IOC. Really, really is, I think, especially because there's similar events happened with the bidding for the Tokyo Olympics in 2020.
Yeah, a lot of the same characters, the Diacs, have come up. This investigation actually stemmed from a French investigation into sports corruption, and that was shared with Brazilian investigators several years ago, as long ago as I think 2017. The thing is, this is also such a sad conclusion to South America's first Olympics. Nuzman was, I was living in Brazil at the time of those Olympics and the build up to it. Nuzman, a very combustible figure, didn't like being questioned, extremely powerful. But those Olympics are mired in corruption from start to finish now. Obviously, you have this bidding scandal that we discussed. And then you have the actual Olympics themselves in a country where there is huge amounts of poverty, searing inequality. They spent billions of dollars on producing this Olympics, which was constructed also on the back of corruption. There was a major graft inquiry in Brazil on infrastructure projects, and no surprise, the Olympics were part of those. So the legacy of that Olympics is not a good one. And if you look at what's been left behind, a bunch of concrete arenas that have fallen into, in a large part, disrepair. The head of the Brazilian Olympic Organizing Committee, as we've discussed, sentenced to jail for more than 30 years. And the likelihood of a major South American city getting the Olympics again is very rare at this moment in time.
Maybe the legacy is the fact the IOC has largely taken the members' decision out of the process for choosing an Olympic host. We've seen with the 2032 Olympics being awarded through the behind-the-scenes process to Brisbane. There was no say of the members. It was just cooked up behind the scenes, which raised further issues of transparency of process, but maybe as a reflection that voting processes can't be trusted and they will be tainted, because this Rio vote buying and bribery happened, of course, 2009 was the decision by the IOC when they beat the likes of Chicago and Paris. Well, of course, the century had started with the Salt Lake City Olympics, which had been marred in a bribery scandal too at the Olympics.
Yeah, look, the IOC don't come across well here for a number of reasons. Another one, I spoke to a guy and had been speaking to him, written a story about him. He was a whistleblower from inside the Brazilian Olympic Committee from as long ago as 2007 and 2008, writing to senior figures in the IOC, including current President Thomas Bach and his late predecessor as well, saying Nuzman was up to no good. They should investigate. Guess what? They completely ignored him. This is, again, we talked about transparency at the start when it comes to football. This is another organization that we don't know how it investigates, when it investigates. We only find out an outcome, and it's often a desired outcome at a desired time for the International Olympic Committee, or they're embarrassed by the judicial process in countries outside of its own sports orbit.
And now elsewhere in the IOC orbit, there are questions over whether or not they're too willing to take the Chinese account over the fate of Peng Shuai. So many concerns about her fate. The 3 weeks she disappeared from public view. The tennis star, she's former top-ranked doubles player, winner of the doubles title at Wimbledon in the past. And then she held a video call with the IOC president Thomas Bach last weekend. It went on for 30 minutes, they say, and the IOC almost sort of suggesting, well, that shows it. We know where she is, and maybe Thomas Bach and Peng Shuai can have a meal together. They can meet up at the Beijing Olympics at the start of next year. But still so many questions about just where she is and how freely she might have been speaking.
Yeah, the IOC were making a lot of noises around quiet diplomacy. That was the best way they were going to sort this out. And I think they thought that they had sort of answered all the questions, but actually a lot of people not happy at all about this phone call, including the Women's Tennis Association. So I don't think it's over yet, Tariq.
No, and you're right. The manner of it just leaves a funny taste. We have no details of what was discussed. Peng Shuai made some serious allegations against a senior Chinese government official of sexual assault. The IOC statement didn't reference that at all. It just said she's looking well and wants to sort of maintain her privacy, and then hopefully that the issue goes away. From my point, I think the IOC and China both found themselves in the same position in a way, under huge pressure to say something, to do something, and they've come up with this solution on the Peng Shuai matter. That's what it seems like. Don't forget, the IOC has an Olympics starting in Beijing in February. That's not a long way away. That seems to be the primary goal, and the other member on that call, or one of the other people on that call, was an IOC official from China, Li Lingwen, who also has had senior government roles with the Chinese Communist Party and the government. Now, again, I think there are more questions than answers there, and people are still right to be concerned about Peng Shuai's fate. Has the IOC helped her, or has the IOC helped itself and the Chinese authorities? I guess depends who you ask, and time will tell.
Yeah, the WTA, their CEO, Steve Simon, still calling for full and fair, transparent investigation and no censorship. And yeah, concerns from Human Rights Watch saying the IOC is actively playing a role in the Chinese government's enforced disappearance, coercion, and propaganda machinery. Well, a few months after we focused on the pod on the debut at the Olympics of Laurel Hubbard, the first openly transgender athlete at the Games, now there are some new IOC regulations on transgender athletes. They've been unveiled by the International Olympic Committee, and what they find is that athletes' testosterone does not impact sporting performance. Well, to talk more now through the new regulations and the various issues around this, we're joined now by Dr Emma Hilton, a developmental biologist from the University of Manchester. Welcome to Sport Unlocked.
Thank you for having me.
So in this announcement, the IOC's medical chief, Dr Richard Budgett, states that testosterone does not impact performance. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a really, really remarkable statement from Richard Budgett. And it's one that I think wherever you are in this debate, if you have any sporting background, any love of sport, to deny the role of testosterone in sporting performance is really an astonishing statement. There is a huge amount of biological evidence about what testosterone does to one's body, what it does to male development, how it's involved in the development of male secondary characteristics, things like height and muscle mass. And to then say that not only it's not testosterone, but it's obviously not testosterone, is really kind of an eye-widening statement.
Emma, is there evidence to suggest that testosterone, scientific evidence, that testosterone has an impact on athletic performance? It's something that we, as journalists, have seemed to have regarded as common understanding for the last decade or more.
There's a very big evidence base for the role of testosterone. This is a hormone. It's a hormone that's much higher in males than it is in females. And there are lots of lab studies about how it affects things like growth of muscle, how it impacts on height, how it impacts on body fat. And those are things that we know feed into sporting performance. And as a developmental biologist, understanding how it operates at this molecular level to really, as we're seeing, change bodies in a way that can't be reversed when you, for example, suppress testosterone in adulthood. I don't think there's any doubt that testosterone is the main driver of performance advantage in sports, and it's a driver that happens quite early on in male development at puberty.
Does the IOC's findings, does it lead us then to the path, well, actually, why is there any mixed gender sport at all?
I think that a feature of the entire document has been to ignore a scientific argument. They don't talk about why we have male and female categories in the first place. They don't talk about things like how testosterone impacts sporting performance. And in trying to, I think, skate over that in pursuit of their primary aim, which is clearly inclusion, in trying to skate over that scientific evidence, what they've done is actually left open a very big question, which is why is there sex segregated sports in the first place? Now, I don't believe the IOC think there's no need for sex segregated sports. They do say up front that women need to have a fair and level playing field. So that suggests, we can infer from that they do understand the need for sex segregation. But what they then do is completely put aside the arguments and the evidence for those categories in favour of kind of coming in right at the end and saying, but you must include regardless. And they're trying to make a special case for trans women. And the special case doesn't hold up when you compare, males as a population.
Emma, if I was to say that trans people, they've gone through terrible traumas in their life, that it's been a really, really difficult time. All they want to do is somebody, if they transition to become a woman, is to be a woman. And this is the IOC are now saying that they should be able to do so without any restrictions and compete as women. It just seems that there are a group of people, scientists, whatever, pushing back against that, and there's such a small number of people involved that really it's unfair on these people who just want to compete as women.
So I think it is fair to acknowledge that trans people go through, they have a kind of particular history, they have a particular life experience, and we need to be empathetic to how trans people are treated in society, and sport is, part of our society. And I think and I completely support the idea that sport should be inclusive. It should be inclusive for all. I'm very keen that everyone should have opportunities to play sport. And if they don't have opportunities to play sport, then we provide those opportunities to play sport. What I don't agree with, and this comes back to some very fundamental reasoning, what I don't agree with and what I don't think is the right approach is that people have the right to choose which category they play sport in, because sporting categories exist out with of a lived experience or a particular kind of, feeling about oneself, or those kinds of things that we think about when we think about trans people. So we can think about social disadvantage, which applies to many different demographics, and we can think about how we, make sport kind of open to people who haven't been able to access that. But that doesn't logically feed into choosing the category that you wish to compete in, and that's essentially what the IOC have done with this document, is say not only does sport need to be inclusive, we all agree with that, I hope, but that there is a right to choose a category, and that's a right that wouldn't be given to anyone else who wanted to compete in a category that's set up to account for physical differences.
How should the sporting world grapple going forward with those identifying as non-binary in terms of which category they compete in?
Well, so I find this quite problematic because non-binary actually has no legal definition. Certainly in the UK, there's no legal definition of non-binary. So while we can talk about male, female, men, women, what those terms mean in kind of legal and social senses, non-binary has no legal status in the UK. And what we've seen is some sports federations, I think US gymnastics, in their policy now, the way they deal with non-binary people is to say, you can just choose year on year which category you want to compete in. And this is going to be deeply problematic, because this is essentially, as we talked about earlier, this is undermining the very premise of categories altogether.
This discussion, the debate over the guidelines the IOC has, it's become very heated. What is your assessment of the wider discussion and how it's unfolding?
We're dealing with two very different groups of people who have very different kind of priorities about sport. And those two different priorities were outlined quite explicitly, actually, in this Sports Council guidance that was published about 6 weeks ago now. They talked about, when they were talking about this issue with different groups, people could be divided into two different kind of moral imperatives. One was inclusion and one was fairness. And there's no hierarchy between those in terms of, one's own moral feelings. It's about how you interact with sport and what you feel is important. Is it the integrity of fairness within sport, or is it sport as a means to, have a inclusive society? And so you've got two groups of people who feel that they're morally correct about dealing with this sport. And so when you start to argue with the other side or debate, or in some cases even just want to discuss, people feel attacked and they feel it quite personally. So I understand the level of, or the height of feeling, if you like, in terms of actual toxicity. What I've experienced talking about how I think sport should move forward, and that is being led by the science. And at the moment, I don't think the scientific data supports the inclusion of trans women in female categories. It may be that sometime in the future, with different treatments or different kind of pathways through transition, that may change. But at the moment, I don't think the science supports inclusion. And for that, which I have evidence scientifically, I've been called transphobic, I've been accused of hate speech, I've been reported to the police for hate crimes. My institute has received complaints about me. And so that's very unusual as an academic who I thought was doing something quite academic around this debate to experience that. And I do understand the feelings behind that, but the extent of the actions now is becoming a little bit unmanageable, I think, and we really need some sensible discussion moving forward. And I'm not clear that the IOC document has provided a platform for sensible discussion here.
What happened with those police investigations? What were they asking you? How did the investigation come to a conclusion?
I've never heard from the police. I've not been arrested, so I assume that there was no case to answer. I'm easy to find. But UK hate crime law is such that if you have a hate crime incident on your record, I've never been in trouble with the police in my life. But apparently now I have a hate crime incident, on a record that will stay there. It can't be removed. I've never been sanctioned in any way for what I've said, not even on social media, which tends to be quite quick with the, the banning and the blocking buttons. So these are now if I'm charitable, mischievous complaints, but if I were less charitable, I'd say they're malicious and they're without basis.
Emma, thank you very much for joining us on Sport Unlocked.
Thank you for having me.
Dr Emma Hilton from the University of Manchester, bringing a close to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. And if you've got any feedback, you can always message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're sportunlockedpod@gmail.com. And if you can hit subscribe on your pod platform provider, even better. But for now, from me, Rob Harris, from Martyn, Ziegler and Tariq Panja, thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.